Hi, I'm Franco Ubaudi, uh, and I was asked a question regarding how one could actually produce a bunch of indexes such that those indexes enable you to provide a sorted version of some vector of randomly organized characters. That sounds like a mouthful, but as we go along, everything should hopefully be very clear. Okay, so to do this, I'm just going to use letters of the alphabet as the symbols or characters or whatever you want to call them. A bunch of symbols that are in some sort of random order, and the goal is to produce a sorted version. Now, to do this, I'm going to start with my random set. To generate that, I'm going to use the sample function. I'm going to make use of the letters of the alphabet variable, and I'm going to select 15 letters from that vector, the letters vector, such that they all are at random. I also want the ability to be able to potentially have more than one of any letter. So therefore I set replace to true. So therefore potentially, for instance, you could have the letter E occurring multiple times, potentially. So we're going to save all of that in a vector called source, or SRC, which is short for source. Okay, so there we've done it. We've created our vector of 15 characters. Our first one happens to be W, the next one's B, so they look pretty much all over the place, which is what was desired. We want to summarize things, which could be handy, and we could use the table function to do exactly that. And therefore we find straight away these are the unique letters that appear in the source vector, and it also tells you the frequency of each. So the letter B occurs twice, the letter F occurs also twice, and M even occurs 3 times, etc. Right, fantastic. Now, what we want to look at is what the order function actually does for us. And what I'll do is I'll save the result of that in a variable called ind, which is short for indexes. So ind contains a bunch of numbers which actually correspond to indexes, such that when those indexes are used, that gives us a sorted version of the contents of source. For instance, the source, and if we stick the vector ind inside it, the end result is a sorted version of source. Now, so we've got that, and I'm also, to make life easier for us in understanding, I'm going to create a destination vector which contains a sorted version of the characters in source. And there we have it. Okay, now what else? I'm thinking for a moment, make sure I haven't forgot anything. Okay, so we've got all the bits and pieces, but to make things easier to understand, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a grid or a table-like layout, and then we can visualize things nice and easily. To do so, I want to, for convenience, I'm going to create a blank vector, which literally contains, as the name implies, a bunch of blanks. It's going to be of the same length as the source vector. Now, I'm going to create this table structure or grid structure, and I'm going to use the CMD function to do it. So meaning, therefore, I'm going to connect together a bunch of vectors on a column per column basis. So the first column of the structure we're about to build will be the source vector. The next will be the blank, spelled correctly hopefully, and the index vector and the destination vector. So we've got all that. Let's now see what that looks like. Okay, so this is our source vector, the vector originally created with a random assortment of vectors from the alphabet, or letters from the alphabet. Just a nice spacing here, the blank vector, our index vector, and our destination vector. Now, a number of ways we can interpret this, the index vector that is. The letter B, we're talking about the letter B in its correct position, in a sorted position, according to the index vector, it can be found in position 2 of the source vector. The next letter B can be found in position 6 in the source vector, so on and so forth. The other way you could view it is, if you work your way through the index column, you go, okay, the first character of my sorted version can be found in position 2, our next character at position 6, our next character at position 9, etc. So that's what the index vector is. Now, I've made use of built-in functions, order, sort. Now, you could obviously write those yourself or use different versions of it. I'll assume that you already got that, but the question is, well, how could I create my own version of order? It's actually not that hard at all. What you would do is, you probably would have a set of for loops, nested for loops. In other words, you'd have an outer for loop and an inner for loop. The outer for loop would traverse the dest column or dest vector. So it begins at the very beginning of that. So it starts at position 1 and it finds the letter B. So obviously our goal here is to create the contents of the index column. Okay, so we've got the letter B, and what we do is we now go to our inner for loop and we work our way from the beginning through the source vector looking for our first occurrence of B, and we find that occurs at position 2. And we know that because if we used the letter J in our inner for loop to index through the source vector, then it's just the letter J contains 2, that's where that is, and we then have our first entry for the index column. Now before we move to the next character, we need to ask the question, is the next character different to the one we just processed? In this case, it's not. So therefore, we should not start our next pass through the source vector from the very beginning of it. We should rather pick up from where we left off. And where we left off is actually pretty easy. That's the last entry that we put into the index vector, position 2, so we should start from position 3. So from position 3, we look through the remainder of the source vector looking for a letter B, and we find it occurs at position 6, and it's there we have our next entry for the index vector. We check the next letter and we find it's different, so therefore we keep that in mind. So therefore, as we begin our search for the letter E in source, we start from the beginning of the source vector. We find that we see the letter E occurs at position 9, hence we've got our next entry. And you can repeat this. F is different. Start at the very beginning of the source vector, look for the first occurrence of F. Turns out to be position 3, so we've got that number. The next letter is no different, so therefore we pick up from position 3, or if you like position 4 in the source vector, looking for the next F. And we progress from there and eventually find the next occurrence of F is at position 11. But that's the basic logic you could use in order to create the contents of the index column.